And now let me introduce our feature speaker from the Claremont Graduate University Drucker School of Management, Professor Katerina Pick. Professor Pick received her PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard, where her research included group dynamics and leadership, especially for corporate boards. Her CGU syllabus begins with a quote from Warren Bennis: "Management can be taught, but leadership must be learned." Very interesting idea. If you have any questions during her talk, please type the questions in the chat window and we'll get to the questions after Kat's talk. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you, AJ. Wonderful introduction and also great segue from the art talk and Martin Luther King, of course. Like you said, AJ, I teach an entire semester of leadership, and that is nowhere near long enough. So 20 minutes definitely isn't long enough, but I've done my best to kind of distill a few points from the work that I've been doing in teaching leadership and what I see as kind of the state of play in leadership and specifically leadership development. And I'll explain why in just a second. But maybe I'll just, if I can, I'll share my screen. I do have some PowerPoints that I always hate sharing my screen because then everybody gets really small and I would prefer to see your faces. But I think that this can kind of help us get some visual learning that comes with this. So like AJ said, I have this course that I teach on leadership development that starts with a quote that may be a little bit provocative. This idea from Warren Bennis that really he shared after decades of really interesting research on leadership, qualitative research. So a lot of deep insight. Many of you may know him. He was a scholar at USC, taught at the business school at USC. But this quote, management can be taught, leadership must be learned. Certainly, we don't want to diminish management in any way, especially not as a Drucker disciple. We don't want to diminish management. But what this quotation really references is the fact that for developing leadership, there really is very little in the way of clear prescriptions, right? Or clear skills and tools that once you develop them, you are going to be a great or even a good leader. So leadership really requires so much more than that, right? It's about deep awareness. You have to have a deep passion for something. You have to have really deep knowledge of your context. You have to persevere in understanding that context. You have to have the ability to inspire people. I'm describing Dr. Martin Luther King since you mentioned him right at the beginning of the talk, but you have to care about something, right? You have to move people in a direction rather than standing still. And that's difficult, right? And you do that by tapping into who you are, by knowing what moves you and knowing what hinders you. And, that's really about human development more than it is about learning any particular leadership skill or approach. And it certainly has become clear, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years that our approach to leadership development is incomplete, if not wholly inadequate. We get very frustrated at the seemingly, when our leadership programs are ineffectual. We get baffled at the behaviors of some leaders who seem so competent and prepared and yet behave in ways that we don't understand or that seemingly create negative outcomes. And I would say that this is in large part driven by what I'm going to call the leadership blind spot, which is that most of our leadership discussion and training is focused on competencies and skills, and not at all on the human being who is going to act out those competencies and skills. And we don't acknowledge that in order for someone to really perform what they've learned in leadership, they have to develop some much more intangible capacities for leadership, things like, flexibility of mind, compassion, courage, empathy, humility, self-awareness, just to name a few, right? And those things are, more difficult to learn. I have a street light here because Sometimes this is called the streetlight effect in other areas. It's the fable of the person who's looking for their lost car keys under the streetlight, even though they dropped them across the street. And when you ask them why, they say, oh, because the light's better here. So this is what we do with leadership, right? We focus where it's easy to look. It's easy to focus on competencies. It's not so easy to focus on the interior of the human being. And yet this is where the magic is, right? This is where so much is determined. And I love this quotation from Bill O'Brien. He has a lot of experience with managing organizational change. And I think this quotation is really, it's accurate. Many of us, we believe it intuitively, but I think we sometimes forget when we talk about leadership training. And I always share this, just recently on NPR, they were talking about a very old experiment where someone, a research psychologist, had this trick he pulled on his lab where he went in the night and he put signs on all the cages for the rats that said either incredibly smart or incredibly dumb, just kind of in the corner of the cage. And then later that week, he brought in a group of experimenters and just gave them the instruction to, this is your rat, you run it through the maze and check its performance, et cetera. And what they found is that the rats, the ones that were labeled incredibly smart did almost twice as well as the rats that were labeled incredibly dumb, even though they were the exact same albino research rat, right? So, it's just a simple example, right? But I think we all know this. And today, neuroscience research is telling us more and more about the things that live inside the body that we unintentionally communicate to our surroundings that dramatically influence our ability to connect, to lead, to be trusted, to inspire, all of those things. So I think this is where leadership, training must be oriented. And in a way, for me, that, it doesn't bode well for me when I say leadership can't be taught. I'm a professor, so it doesn't bode well for my field. But I have developed a course, with that in mind. And I think organizations also can orient themselves in this way in their leadership development, right? It's about giving people the opportunity to learn from experience and teaching them how to integrate experiences. That's maybe even more important, because we do know that the majority of leadership, despite the, always like, are leaders born or made, that has been pretty well settled, I think, in decades of research that pretty convincingly demonstrate that the vast majority of leadership ability is developed, it's learned. But we have even more information, which is that ability is learned not so much in the classroom or by, reading books, but through experience, by having experiences and learning from them. And so I have another quote here from Warren Bennis, because I think it's so important that experience is tricky, right? It isn't that you have an experience and you automatically, pull that in and grow from it. No, you have to be a certain way with your experiences in order to learn. So, this idea that, you can have lots of experiences, but they really aren't yours until you really think about them, process them, examine them, figure out what they mean. And it's very interesting when you talk to really kind of successful leaders later, and they can tell you with incredible detail how a particular experience shaped them. It's amazing. And so, part of the effort here has to be around how do we teach people to integrate experiences? So this is a big model and I can't talk through all of it, but I wanted to just share it with you. It's a really powerful model developed by these two professors at the University of Michigan that is a very effective way of integrating and opening yourself to leadership development through experience. I'll touch briefly on these three that I've highlighted, but you can see that it's really it's how do you approach things, right? Kind of a mindset thing. What are some actions you take? And then how do you reflect, which for some people that's the hardest part, right? It's like finding time and all of that stuff. But The first one, up in that upper right hand, the learning orientation, that sounds pretty obvious, right? We all want to learn, but it's actually about something very specific. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. She wrote the book Mindset, and she did some really interesting research where she found that people basically have kind of one of two mindsets. One is a fixed mindset. People with a fixed mindset believe that big things like intelligence, important personality traits are more or less fixed, right? Like you have what you have and you work with it. That's one kind of mindset. People who have the other, which is called the growth mindset, think very differently. They believe that things like intelligence are growable and that there's almost no limit to what you can develop, and that ultimately you can change almost anything about yourself. So very different mindsets, right? And not surprisingly, these two different mindsets do things very differently. They think very differently, and they behave very differently, particularly when it comes to things like learning and failure, and things like that. So people with a fixed mindset are very concerned about performing, right? About demonstrating and proving what they have. And that makes sense, right? Because it's limited. So you have to demonstrate how much is there. So they need to ensure that they're going to succeed at whatever they're doing, right? And so, they can hold themselves back. They don't take risks. They don't stretch themselves, and also don't tend to look for feedback as much. So people with a growth mindset, though, are really the opposite. Because they believe their assets can be developed, they see, opportunity everywhere. So they do stretch themselves, they take risks, and they're constantly looking for feedback. So, and they handle failure very differently. They think it's like just another opportunity to learn. So obviously this is really important if you think about, how do you seek out and learn from experience? So you can ask yourself, which of these mindsets really characterizes you? I also think, or where do you kind of spend most of your time? And I also think organizations can have a mindset in their culture, right? Is it really about performing, or is there always an opportunity to learn? And that is kind of the priority. You can also have one mindset in some areas, like maybe you believe, intelligence can be grown, but artistic talent, nope, that's it. You either have it or you don't, right? And there's lots of messages that we get, from childhood on that shape those mindsets. But there's evidence that you can shift your mindset. It's about adopting that other, thing that's really a reality. When I teach this in class, I get a lot of resistance. I get a lot of like, no, intelligence is set. IQ is set. And people are very uncomfortable with the idea that these things can change. And yet I think the research, brain development and things like that, the research really leans much more in the growth direction. So, okay, so I want to make sure I don't run out of time. So
Don't worry, this is great.
Okay, so I'll just move on to experimentation. This is just one action that I encourage people to really emphasize. And, experimentation is about getting playful. It's about being playful with who you are and how you develop new skills. And the reason this is so difficult in leadership is because we bump up against something called authenticity. and rightfully so, right? People get very attached to, well, I am not going to lead that way because that's not who I am. That doesn't feel authentic to me. And yet what we know about learning and even, self-development is that we go through stages of doing things that don't feel quite right on the way to learning them, right? Like you act something out, you do a skill, for an athlete, I'm an athlete. So, I know what it means to try something differently. It doesn't feel right. You do it for months and then all of a sudden it feels right. So leadership is like that too. And there are lots of challenges when you move into different aspects of leadership where you may be asked to do something like, for example, sell your ideas. Some people are very uncomfortable with that. Some people say, well, if my idea is the best idea, it's going to get chosen, and I'm not going to manipulate the process by going around and selling it. That does not feel authentic to me, right? And it's, and yet it's a really important leadership skill. And so that's another question to ask yourself is, are there some areas where you may be holding yourself back because you're holding on to something that feels more authentic? And I don't want to advocate ever leaving behind the core, right, of what is authentically you, your values and things like that. But are there some places where you can be playful, where you can try a behavior, see what it feels like? Because the research shows actually that there are people who do this. They see this, they don't see their self as being so unitary. They see themselves as having many selves. And so they try out different behaviors, almost like you're trying out a different outfit. And it turns out that the people who do that actually arrive at their core authentic self more quickly than those who don't, who hold to a core and don't try things. So that's an interesting one.
Wow.
And then the last thing is reflection, right? After action reviews, creating some kind of structured process where you ask yourself, what happened? Why did it happen? How is this similar to other situations I've been in? And what can I learn here? And just, if you can do a weekly process, a regular process, it's probably one of the most important things you can do in terms of integrating.
Wow.
So that's the learning from experience advice that I have for people, and just kind of like situating it in the larger, how do we think about leadership and developing good leadership?
Some really fantastic ideas, Katerina.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
agree.
So it really sounds like we all should be very open to the individual journey that each of us has to take to experiment and basically try new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some interesting ideas. And I that reflection part fits right in line, I think, at least with a lot of things which I've interpreted in terms of Peter F. Drucker's teachings in terms of
Yeah,
self-regulation.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. My dad was a USC grad and a student of both Drucker and Warren Bennis, and he gave me this book early in my
Yes.
career.
That is the S.
Yep. And,
That's a wonderful.
I've read it several times. It's
yeah.
There's
it's
a lot of great
wonderful
lessons in there.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting question in the chat about charisma. Can you speak a little bit to charisma and its role in leadership?
Yeah. So charisma is one of those really double-edged swords. And in fact, Peter Drucker hated charisma. He thought it was very dangerous because it moves people. And it can move people it's very powerful. It can move people in directions that are not good, obviously. There's a good deal of overlap between what we call transformational leadership and charismatic leadership. But transformational leaders, one thing they do very differently is they actually want their followers to challenge them and to disagree with them and to have a constant development, growing process. Whereas charismatic leaders demand loyalty, right? You don't want disagreement. And so those are helpful ways to kind of differentiate. Like, am I following a transformational leader or am I following a charismatic leader? And the other thing about charisma is that people always think that it's inborn, that some people just have, but it actually can be learned. You can learn certain behaviors that amount to, having that effect of charismatic leadership.
Wow. Some really interesting ideas. And you gave me hope, because when I retire, I always hope to be a rock star.
Yes, you can do it. I firmly believe it.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pick. This really incredible ideas. We'd love to have you come back and talk more about this. This is
Yep.
kind of an interesting thing about our company. For 40 years, we've always have, it's been hard to put a finger on it or define it, but one of the things that we've heard from many of our clients is that they've appreciated our ability to come in and actually exhibit some really strong leadership skills amongst their teams. And we've never really been able to figure out what that recipe was or
Yeah,
how we actually did it. So we'd love to have you come back and
yeah, that's
talk
wonderful.
more. Yeah.
Absolutely. AJ, the professional characteristics survey in Todd is our self-evaluation tool for leadership attributes. And our engagements often involve directing and coordinating the work of other team members as well as our clients, and understanding the individual's leadership attributes or your own leadership attributes is really important to being effective in that role. And so I'd like to encourage everybody who hasn't yet taken the survey to please take the time to do it. I think you'll get some interesting insights from it. And it only takes about 5 minutes. So, you can find this in your Todd profile on the bio tab, and take the time. It's really worth the time spent.
Absolutely. And what I've took away from this morning's conversation with Professor Pick is you can actually develop and learn new leadership attributes. So
Right.
I'm really looking forward to future sessions on that. And
Me too.
Can I add one more thing since I'm hearing you talk about, the thing that I didn't cover today is sort of the why. And this is the why of leadership is what holds it all together, right? And I think it's really important for everyone to also identify their why. And it doesn't have to be a grand mission like end world hunger. It could be, I see a divided world and I want to lead a team that is connected and trusting and produces positive outcomes, but there has to be a why, because sometimes we'll get students that I want to be a leader. Well, why? For what? Leadership, outside of a purpose doesn't really mean anything.
Indeed. And I think sometimes we don't also recognize the role of followers.
Right.
Yeah.
When you think about that as well, right? Yeah. Really interesting ideas. Thank you so much for you spending the time with us, and we're looking forward to more discussions in the future.